going to build a UI, a user interface in your game. And typically, UI is created with 2D assets. And so what I want to do is I want to go to the UI folder, and remember you can find this in the project files folder if you import the Unity package for this module. In the UI folder, I have this texture that is created, and what I want to do is I want to go to the inspector. Now in the inspector, you'll see that the texture type is set to default. Normally this is for any texture that is going to go on like a 3D object, or it could even be used for sprites or whatever, but we need to make sure that we set it properly for a UI. So looking at this, we see that we have a normal map, and remember the normal map issue that we had before where we had to fix those, and this is what it does, is it actually sets this as a normal map. You also have the ability to use the legacy GUI in this, and I don't really want to use that. I would actually like to use a sprite, meaning a 2D and UI is the category in that. Now there are other types of 2D assets or texture types that you can use, but let's go ahead and click on sprite. Now this is just going to give us some parameters that are going to be very helpful for us whenever we create our sprites, if we're creating a 2D game, or our UI. So in this case, we have our sprite mode, and right now it's set to single. You could set it to multiple or even polygonal, or a polygon. And what this means is that if we have assets like an asset list or a texture atlas, we can actually have multiple textures or sprites on a single texture sheet. And multiple would allow you to cut that up. Now typically with multiple, you would have to set it up per pixel, so it's kind of like a grid base. Now you also have polygon, where you can actually come in and modify it and use a texture atlas that is not necessarily set up like a grid. So let's go ahead and go to single, and I'm going to use the pixels per unit at 100. The mesh type we're just going to use as a tight. You could use full rect if you like, but it doesn't really matter at this point. Seeing how it is just a single, it might be better to use the full rect, but I'm just going to leave it the way that it is. We're going to set the pivot to center, and I don't want to extrude any edges or anything like that. Now the really cool part is that we can actually go into the sprite editor and we can start to modify this. Now we have to apply our settings before we can go into the sprite editor. So go ahead and hit apply. And you'll notice here that instead of the weird colors that were coming off of the edge of that, because it was recognizing the alpha, we actually have this checker pattern in the background, which does show us that this is an alpha. Now the sprite editor is going to pop up here, and you can go ahead and just pop it into the area where the scene view is, and this is going to allow you to modify the overall bounds of your sprite. Now I could come in and I could drag these handles around, and I could actually make this a little bit smaller. Now it's really not a reason to do this, to be honest. We can go ahead and just leave it the way that it is. This is beneficial if we were to have, let's say, multiple assets or multiple sprites in this thing. We could go ahead and we could set that to multiple, and then we could start to modify this. So this is pretty good for now. So now that we have that all set, we have our pivot set to the center, and I think that that would be pretty good for this object. We could set it to the bottom. Now we'll go ahead and we'll leave it at center. So now that we have that set for the sprite editor, all we have to do now is just simply hit apply, and that will set that up. Now on the sprites themselves, you also have this advanced category, and you can check where the alpha source is. In this case, it's in the input of the alpha itself. So this is an RGBA, meaning that the texture file itself, which is a .png, saves alpha information. And so we're just gaining that alpha information from the object itself. We're also telling it that alpha is transparent. You could turn this off and then hit apply, and you would get a different result. So you can see that it goes back to that original option where it starts to drag those colors out. In our case, we want it to show as transparent. Now with UI, typically you want to steer away from using mipmaps on this. And so what I would do is tell it not to generate any mipmaps. Now mipmaps are for texturing optimization. So whenever you get really far away from a texture, Unity automatically creates a bitmap or a lower resolution of that texture to save on memory space while it's rendering. So I think everything else is pretty good. We could set the wrap mode to per axis. We'll go ahead and we'll clamp in the U direction and then also clamp it in the V direction, just so that way it doesn't wrap twice or continue to tile over. And I think everything else will leave it just as it is. Now the original size of this file is 1024 by 1024, and you'll see that the max size is set to 2048. Now we could leave it at this. It's not going to change this unless we were to come in and say, all right, we want the max size to be 512. Once we hit apply, then you'll see that it knocks it down to that 512. Now typically with UI elements like this, you do want to use smaller resolutions on this. Now that is a little bit too small. This is going to be on screen and we do want things to be sharper than that. But here you can see that that's a pretty good quality. We might even try to take a look at it at 1024. And not a lot different, but I think that that's perfectly fine. All right, so that's how we can manage our 2D assets and we can start to cut them up. Now, there are other UI elements that we can begin to use in this. It's not just this image. There are specific ways that we can set up other UI elements, and we'll talk about how we can do that next.